Thank you.
Yeah. It's been a very wonderful pleasure to kind of very slowly, very briefly get to know you over the past day or so, and maybe through like a couple of IG posts, probably about astrology. And I'm just super thankful that you let two strangers convince you to come to Cincinnati.
Yeah, I can attest to Lisa's superpower of giving time, because I felt yesterday that you gave me not just time, but so much of your attention, and also Ashley Devon, who is also here with us today, and just y'all have been so welcoming, and everyone here at the Urban Consulate and the People's Liberty. It's been really beautiful. Oh.
Yeah, we got to talk a lot yesterday about a number of different things, and I think for me, and never mind. I was gonna say I might derail this, but I was like, I don't care if I do. But I guess for me, I kind of am struggling with the idea of thinking so far ahead, thinking out to like 2045 or to whatever. I think it's hard for me to immediately jump to like what could be the answers for that, because I'm thinking about like right now who I might be working with, the sort of burdens that they endure because of a lot of things attached to specifically capitalism or racism or anything like that. And so I think that if I can ask you a question, I think it's in considering just environmental situations and considering like the black and browning of our nation in the many upcoming years or whatever, and in considering the threats of like social political issues or, outside of capitalism or whatever, what's the significance of community?
I think that at least for me, I've been thinking a lot about, so our question that we were asked, or the question that we sort of came upon because of Ashley Devon, was what is the role of the poet in community maintenance? Mm-hmm. And so it's been on my mind since we've been tossing that question around. And I'm here from Austin. I've lived in Austin pretty much since around 2000. I went to college there, and I moved away and went to grad school, and I was gone probably about 7 years, and then I moved back in 2009. So I guess in like a geographical sense, Austin is my immediate community, and then I think in a larger sense, Texas, because I have a great love, even if it's a complicated relationship, to that place because of its history. It is like the land where I come from. And so I also consider Texas my community, and for better or worse, having been born in the United States, this country is also my community. But I think in a larger sense, I also like to think of myself as part of a global community. I wrote down this quote from, I think it was, where should I put it? Now, of course I can't find it. It was a quote, I think, from June Jordan. But basically, she, from the poet June Jordan, who is Jamaican American, and she kind of just says that we can't be poets unless that we think about people other than ourselves. And I think that for me that is really important in the construction of the idea of what is a poet and what is our responsibility, because a poet can, I think that anyone can be a poet. If people want to write, then they can be a poet. But I think for me, yes, I write, but also I feel called to a purpose. And that purpose for me is participating in a larger change in our society. For me, it is to challenge space. It is to challenge the systems, I think, that have been put into place in our country and in other places that hurt other people, you know? And I guess so, in a sense, that is like kind of what I understand my community to be, is like a larger scale.
Yeah. I think a lot of what we were talking about yesterday was just like, I think when we were walking, we were like, one of us was saying, like, I don't need to be the center of attention. I don't want to be the center of attention. I'd prefer not to be. And what I'd actually prefer is just to like provide platforms for other people, for the community around me, to provide access, to provide information, and to kind of uplift them in that sort of way. And that a lot of what we were saying, it felt very much like in service to or of a community that we like more broadly serve. Does community or does that platform ever come up in your work or in the ways that you navigate space with people?
I think that it comes up pretty often, just because, you know, one, as being Mexican, and then two, being gay, I think that those things come up pretty often for me, because of spaces that I'm invited to, spaces that I get asked to participate in. I try to always be pretty conscious about when I am invited into certain spaces. I always think about who isn't there and who isn't being invited to those spaces. Because for many years and for a good part of my life, you know, I know what it's like to be excluded from spaces. And I think that part of what I want to do, if you're going to give me a platform, is to make sure that that other people are not excluded. And so I think that one of my other great gifts is to make space for other people. Yeah. And I think that is, at least for me, that's what I understand like the role of the poet to be also, is to make space and create space.
Yeah, we were saying, I mean, one of the other superpower of yours was, you know, listening. And I think that in listening to people, to others, there is opportunity for like just observation, to gather information, to learn nuance, to learn whatever. You're picking up on a lot when you are listening, and whether that's emotion, whether that's narrative, whether that's like all the lineage of everything that a person is carrying with them, or how they're interacting with the people around them. You're listening, you're actively participating in that. And I think in that there is a lot of like examination that can happen to you, because I think with poets, I think that there's like a critical thinking to the observation, to the listening, to the engaging with another person. And I think for me as a poet, a lot of what I feel my purpose or my role within that space is to be the observer and to take it all in and to critique it, to question, to ask, you know, why is this the way that it is? Why do you have to experience that? Why? What can you do to bring yourself out of that? Is that your responsibility? And I think that poetry for me, and then the role of a poet, I feel like, is to pursue those questions and to you know, make other people have to pursue them. And I think yesterday you said in our like round circle or whatever, you said something about, you know, I want my work and I want what I'm doing to make people think. And I really appreciated that. I don't know if you have any thoughts about it.
Yeah, I do. I was, you know, I was taking notes, and actually this morning I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine, and we were talking about the poet Federico Garcia Lorca, who was a Spanish poet. And very briefly, Garcia Lorca was a gay socialist, and during Franco's regime in Spain, and he fled to the U.S. He went to New York. He wrote a lot of poems there. He wrote a book called Poet in New York, and he was in exile, he had to leave Spain because of everything that was going on there. And then at some point he decided that he had to go back because he felt called to go back home, even though he knew it was a great risk for him to return. And so he went back to Spain, and a week after he had returned home, he was kidnapped and then he was executed. And they've never found his body. No one to this day knows where he is buried. And so anyway, we were talking about that this morning, and I was, and I think a lot about artists that have challenged governments, artists that have challenged structures, and that this is those are possible consequences. So in being asked that question, what is 2045 going to look like? I'm not thinking about it as a goal. I'm thinking about, for me, I think about what it is going to look like from an environmental perspective, from a political perspective. What is it going to look like? Are we even going to be there for that? And so I was rereading this interview with Eve Ewing, who's a poet in Chicago, and she says, artists play a role in challenging authoritarianism and creating pathways for subversion, for political understanding and solidarity. Poets show us that lives other than their own are valuable. And so I kind of wanted to throw that back at you and kind of see what you feel about that.
I think that is a really interesting, I really appreciate that quote too, just for it's to have, it sucks that that people in general have to demonstrate that another person is valuable or has worth. But if it is a thing that has to exist, then I think that is a very valuable position for a poet to operate in as someone who is not necessarily apart from, but is doing that observing, is doing that interacting, but then is also asking those questions about it. So I don't know. I value that, and I think that within my work, whether I was talking yesterday, just a lot of prosy kind of poetry or whatever, a lot of memories that are enacted into a little subtext of whatever. It's always focusing on people, always focusing on the relationships that I've had with people, but then also asking all this other questions about what that relationship is, what that relationship means, and then to take those pieces and to be able to share those with others, whether I'm reading it at some poetry reading, or whether that becomes something in lyrical text or whatever, that then humanizes another person or another person's processing about whatever happened or about the relationship with that person. That offers that to another person to then examine and interpret and then put out into the world again. That makes sense.
Yeah. Do we have 5 minutes? Were you showing me the card? Okay. I was asking because we had discussed before we came on that we would try to spend the last 5 or 10 minutes opening up the floor in case people had questions for us.
Yeah, we're breaking the rules.
Yeah, that's what we do. Yeah. So does anyone have questions that they would like to ask us? Yeah.
What's up? You can yell it. It's cool.
Well, I don't know if they can hear on the.
I can. Okay.
Well, so what I wanted to know, how do you tell a story without co-opting a story?
How do you tell a story without co-opting the story? Thank you, Alex.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think it's been a question that has come up often, I think, in conversations around poets. I was at this talk a few weeks ago with this poet, Roger Reeves. I don't know if people know who he is. He's from Jersey. And then John Keane. John Keane is one of the originally founding members of the Darkroom Poets from Boston. And they were in conversation, and that topic came up because John Keane is a little bit older, and Roger and I are almost the same age. Bless you. I think Roger's maybe a little bit older than I am. And we were kind of talking about how when both of us were doing our MFAs, mostly around the same time, I did my MFA from 2003 to 2006. That was a time when people could still do that, I think, and like you were kind of encouraged to tell stories of other people. And now, you know, the conversations have shifted, and so they were kind of just like going back and forth about what to do. And I think like John King kind of talked about it. He has a book called I think it's called Counter Narratives that just came out. It's amazing. And he does a lot of research based on different characters and different people from history. So he did a lot of research on Langston Hughes, and he did some research on on Huckleberry Finn, but not Huckleberry Finn himself, but on the character of Jim. And he kind of like revisits that story because he asks the question, you know, in Huckleberry Finn, no one talks about who Jim is, really. And he wanted to sort of explore that narrative. And so I think that it's, you know, I think that for me, I tend to write from my perspective, and I write a lot about how I experience the world. Even if I'm talking about something that is happening or happening in a different place, I try to make sure that it's like very clear that it is my experience. It is not an experience of another person.
Yeah, no, I think that a lot of my work will just be like my examination of it, or my processing of whatever is being said to me or happening around me or whatever. So it's not that I'm retelling anybody else's story or speaking on their behalf. I'm just expressing my understanding of what is happening with them. So I think I am sharing the story as in this has happened in my time and space, but this is my understanding of it and mine alone. And then that is then someone else kind of receiving and interpreting that how they do.
I think that's why we don't write fiction.
Yeah, both poetry. Poetry, you can do whatever the hell you want.
Yeah. Yeah. Does anyone else have a question? Maybe one more?
Yeah. No questions?
No other questions?
Oh, y'all. Kathy White Wilson is in the room. Oh my God. I'm sorry, I did not see that face. I was so happy. Sorry, interruption, but that was wonderful. I think I feel like there were some things in Mia's talk last night. I have a question. Some things in Mia's talk last night and some conversations that we had that, like, I'm just going to ask you the question that I just genuinely want to ask you. But, like, we've been talking about, like, abolition. Like, what does abolition work look like when it shows up in poetry, and, like, who is that for, and maybe that who changes or whatever, but also like what is it of, and how, does that show up in your work at all, or like does that something that you're trying to pursue a little bit more? I just want to hear you talk about it generally.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully people were here last night for Mia's conversation. It was incredible. She's said a lot of things that just I could never have said as like beautifully. But I think that, you know, I view abolition, at least for me, it's definitely like still a path, like a journey that I'm still on, like because we are so indoctrinated in this society towards certain beliefs and certain ideas, and for me, I've spent a lot of my life unlearning these things, and still continue to unlearn them, and so I think that for me, that's kind of how I view abolition, as like a work in progress, because it is supposed to be, at least in this time and space, a lot of people that talk about abolition now talk about mass incarceration, and they're talking about the prison industrial complex and undoing that. And, you know, Angela Davis wrote this book called Are Prisons Obsolete? Really amazing. And I think that she really like covers a lot of like that kind of conversation. But I think for me, the way that it shows up in my work and in what I do is that I really hope, and it is always my goal, that I am working towards not just my own liberation, but the liberation of other people. And that's how I view abolition work.
Yeah. No, one of the things she said last night that I like for sure retained was that liberation is a slow and continual excising. I like that she used that words. Excising and extraction. And so this is like, yeah, big industry, like big systems and the web of systems that like fuck us all over in all sorts of different ways. That is always in effect, but there is like this constant unlearning of different things that like we can do individually can do the work of, and that we can then share with the people that are around us, the community around us, whomever they might be. And I really like that slow unlearning of different things that you can just like put in a lot of time and work. And that's a lot of like head and heart work that's like not easy. But I think that individually, if everyone is doing that and supported in doing that, I feel like that is, I think maybe, and what you're saying, I'm like, that is a somewhat, I'm gonna at least say this, an abolition of just like excising and like kind of getting rid of parts of yourself that you don't need to hold on to, or parts of understanding that you don't need to hold on to, of what has been learned and kind of indoctrinated into you.
Yeah, and speaking of abolition and speaking of having a platform, this on November the 20th, Texas is going to execute Rodney Reed. I don't know if people know who he is or that story, but I highly encourage you to get on the internet and sign a petition. I think it's freerodneyreed.com. And if you can, like, people are also writing letters to the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, who is an asshole. Yeah. And just, trying to work towards the abolition of the death penalty. But, this obviously is time sensitive, and we don't want Rodney Reed to end up like Troy Davis. So that's I'm just putting that out there. Please, if you have the time, please do that.
Yeah, and I value, I don't know, we're having a platform, and I value that you're sharing that, so people have more, that platform grows bigger, and that more people have that information and can access that. And I think if I'm going to reconnect that to everything, which is, that's valuable too, but if I'm reconnecting that to the conversation and to the work that we're doing here and the conversations that we're having here, I think that like one thing as a like person of color or a black woman or whatever, I'm just like, I'm given a lot of different platforms of access and information, and the way of like making that matter as a poet or as whomever is to just be able to share that information and not to gatekeep it. And I think that going into whatever 2020 has, going into 2045, I just want people to continue to share the wealth of information and knowledge that they have with one another, instead of holding on to it as if it is some scrap that they have been given but they cannot share. And I just want more of that in my world.
Yeah, and I also like my last thoughts are that I think as poets, I think that we can't be afraid. Whatever it is that we're sort of dealing with in the world, or in our immediate communities, I think that we can't be afraid to speak out.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank y'all.